The first time I heard the noise, I honestly thought something was wrong with my air conditioner. I had just gotten back from a 3-day work trip, dragged my suitcase through the kitchen, dropped it by the stairs, and stood there for a second enjoying the silence of being home. Then I heard it, a low mechanical hum, steady and deep, like an engine idling somewhere it absolutely shouldn't have been. At first I ignored it. Townhouses have noises. People slam doors, run dishwashers, start lawn equipment. But this was different. This sound didn't come and go. It sat there, vibrating through the walls like it had signed a lease. I walked through my living room, slid open the back door, and immediately stopped. Mounted directly onto the shared concrete wall between my unit and the neighboring property was a giant gray fiberglass enclosure about the size of a washing machine. Thick blue PVC pipes ran from the box down into the ground and disappeared beneath the brand-new construction site next door. The wall itself was humming. Not figuratively, physically humming. When I placed my hand against it, I could feel the vibration traveling through the concrete. I just stood there staring for a moment because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Somebody had attached industrial pool equipment to my wall without saying a word. Now, to understand why that bothered me so much, you need a little context. I live in an in-unit townhouse built back in the mid-80s. Nothing fancy. Solid construction, narrow backyard, concrete block walls. The kind of neighborhood where people mostly mind their own business. The backyard has always been my favorite part of the property. Years ago, my father spent weekends laying old terracotta tiles across half the yard by hand. Every uneven corner and imperfect line reminded me of him. After he passed, that space became my quiet place. Morning coffee, evening reading, weekend grilling. Nothing glamorous, just peaceful. The shared wall between my unit and the neighboring townhouse was about 8 inches thick and ran the entire length of the property. It wasn't decorative. It served as a firewall and carried electrical conduits for both units. It was one of those things nobody thought about because it simply worked. Strong, silent, reliable. Then the new neighbors arrived. Their names were Bryce and Melanie. They bought the adjoining unit in early spring and immediately launched into what looked like a full-scale renovation project. Dumpsters showed up. Contractors showed up. Trucks showed up. Every day seemed to bring another delivery of materials. Bryce introduced himself on the first afternoon while I was trimming a hedge near the fence line. He leaned over with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own opinion and said, "We're upgrading this whole property, going to bring it into the modern era." I laughed politely and welcomed them to the neighborhood. Then he added something that stuck with me. He pointed toward the property line and said, "Honestly, boundaries are mostly suggestions anyway." He laughed after saying it. I didn't. At the time I figured he was trying to be funny. Looking back, it wasn't a joke. It was a warning label. Over the next few weeks, I learned Bryce worked as a renovation consultant. At least that was his title. What he actually seemed to do was tell other people how they should improve their homes. He always had advice. Always had opinions. My fence needed replacing. My patio needed redesigning. My landscaping was outdated. My exterior paint was apparently holding back the visual potential of the block. Every conversation felt like a free performance review of my property. I mostly smiled and went back inside. Then came the swimming pool project. Now remember, these are townhouses. The yards aren't huge. Fitting a pool back there required excavation, permits, contractors, and a whole lot of planning. For weeks, I watched machinery dig trenches and haul materials through the side access lane. None of that was my business. People can do what they want on their property. The problem started when Bryce decided my property was apparently part of his property. So there I was, standing in my backyard staring at a giant vibrating machine bolted into my wall. I walked next door and knocked. Bryce answered wearing sunglasses despite standing inside his own house. He glanced toward the equipment and immediately knew why I was there. "Pretty impressive, right?" he said. I asked him why there was pool equipment attached to my wall. "Not our wall. My wall." He shrugged and said, "It was the easiest place to mount it. That structure is stronger than anything on my side." I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Then he hit me with the sentence that changed everything. "You'll get used to it after a while." That's when I realized we weren't having the same conversation. I was talking about ownership. He was talking about convenience. I was talking about permission. He was talking about efficiency. And standing there listening to that machine vibrate through the concrete, I had a feeling this wasn't going to end with a simple apology. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people make a mistake when dealing with neighbors like Bryce. Most folks assume the problem is the equipment itself. It usually isn't. The real issue is the decision-making process behind it. This is a psychological trap. Somebody takes a small liberty, gets away with it, then convinces themselves they're entitled to take a larger one. Before long, they're treating your cooperation as an obligation. According to standard procedure, any permanently mounted mechanical equipment is supposed to comply with location requirements, noise regulations, and property boundary restrictions. That isn't bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. Those rules exist because vibrations, structural loads, and long-term maintenance responsibilities can create disputes that last for years. From a legal perspective, once someone physically attaches equipment to a structure they don't exclusively own, they can expose themselves to liability far beyond the cost of the equipment itself. And here's the funny part. People who cut corners often believe they're being clever because they're saving time. In reality, they're usually creating a paper trail that becomes much more expensive later. The lesson here is simple. When someone ignores a boundary because it's convenient for them, don't start with an argument. Start with documentation. Emotions fade, evidence doesn't. The morning after that conversation, I started building a file. Not a revenge plan, not some dramatic neighborhood war strategy, just a file. Photos from every angle, close-ups of the mounting bolts, video recordings of the vibration, audio samples from different locations in my yard, measurements of the equipment's placement. If Bryce wanted to treat property lines like optional suggestions, I was going to treat documentation like a full-time hobby. That evening, I pulled out every piece of paperwork I had on the townhouse. The original survey, the property records, the shared wall provisions, maintenance responsibilities, easements, building requirements. By midnight, my dining room table looked like a small legal archive. The next step was bringing in somebody whose opinion actually mattered. A few years earlier, I had hired a structural engineer named Randall during a drainage issue. He was the kind of guy who spoke only when necessary and somehow made bad news sound boring. 3 days later, he arrived carrying a clipboard and enough equipment to make my backyard look like a science experiment. He spent nearly an hour measuring vibration levels, examining attachment points, checking the conduit locations inside the wall, and reviewing the installation. When he finally finished, he looked at the pump housing, looked at me, and said, "Well, this is going to be a problem." I asked how big of a problem. He tapped the wall and said, "Mechanical equipment attached to a non-approved shared structure, mounted across a property boundary, creating measurable vibration transfer. Whoever approved this installation either didn't know the rules or didn't care." Knowing Bryce, I already had a pretty good guess which option applied. Randall prepared a written report. The language wasn't emotional. It didn't need to be. The facts were strong enough on their own. The installation created structural concerns, crossed ownership boundaries, and appeared inconsistent with local code requirements. Suddenly, the situation wasn't neighbor versus neighbor anymore. It was evidence versus evidence. A few days later, something interesting happened. Instead of hearing from Bryce directly, I received an email from an attorney. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The message was polished, friendly, and carefully worded. It never admitted fault. It never acknowledged any violation. Instead, it described the entire situation as a minor inconvenience and offered a $300 gift card if I would sign a liability waiver and agree not to pursue further action. I read the email twice and actually laughed out loud. Think about that logic for a second. Someone installs expensive equipment on your property without permission, creates ongoing vibration and noise issues, then offers the equivalent of a few grocery trips in exchange for permanent legal protection. That wasn't a settlement. That was an attempt to buy silence on clearance. I didn't write an angry response. I didn't threaten anybody. I simply attached Randall's report, included a formal request for immediate removal, cited the applicable building provisions, and hit send. No insults. No speeches. Just facts. A day later, Bryce spotted me outside collecting my mail. He walked over with that forced smile people use when they're trying very hard not to look nervous. "You know," he said, "there are easier ways to handle things." I told him I agreed completely. He could have asked permission before drilling into someone else's wall. The smile disappeared immediately. For the next week, the atmosphere changed. Every interaction felt tense. Bryce stopped waving. His contractors suddenly avoided eye contact. Melanie, who had previously been friendly, began acting like I had personally created the problem. The machine continued humming every day, but now there was something different beneath the noise. Pressure. They were waiting for me to give up. They assumed I would eventually decide the hassle wasn't worth the effort. That's another psychological trap people fall into. They mistake patience for weakness. They assume calm people aren't doing anything because they can't see what's happening behind the scenes. Meanwhile, I had already submitted the engineer's report, the photographs, the survey documents, and a formal complaint package to the city's compliance office. Then I waited. About 2 weeks later, a white municipal vehicle pulled into the neighborhood. I happened to be working from home that morning. Through my office window, I watched a compliance inspector step out carrying a clipboard, a measuring wheel, and a sound meter. He spent nearly 15 minutes examining the installation. Bryce followed him around talking nonstop. Even from a distance, I could tell he was trying to manage the conversation. The inspector wasn't interested. He measured. He photographed. He checked documents. Then he measured again. Eventually, I walked outside, and the inspector introduced himself. Professional. Calm. No drama. He asked a few questions about when the equipment had been installed and reviewed my documentation. Then he turned back toward the pump housing. The sound meter remained active for several minutes. Finally, he lowered it and shook his head. Bryce immediately launched into an explanation about construction standards, engineering considerations, and modern renovation practices. The inspector listened patiently before interrupting him with a sentence that changed the entire situation. Sir, none of that matters. Bryce stopped talking. The inspector continued. The equipment is mounted on the wrong parcel, attached to a structure outside the approved installation area, and exceeds residential noise limits. Silence. Complete silence. You could practically hear Bryce's confidence hitting the pavement. The inspector handed him a notice. 10 days. Relocate the equipment within 10 days or face enforcement action and escalating penalties. After the inspector left, Bryce stood in his driveway staring at the paperwork like it had personally insulted him. For the next several days, there was a lot of activity next door. Phone calls, contractor visits, meetings in the backyard. At one point, I overheard a heated argument involving somebody who sounded very much like a pool contractor explaining that he had installed the system according to instructions he had been given. That detail mattered. Bryce had spent weeks implying everyone else was responsible. Now the people around him were starting to tell a different story. Day 8 arrived. Nothing happened. Day 9 arrived. Still nothing. By the evening of the 9th day, I honestly wondered whether he planned to ignore the order completely. Then the 10th morning arrived. Around 7:30, a service truck backed into the access lane. 2 technicians stepped out carrying tools and replacement materials. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a seat on the patio. Not because I wanted to celebrate, because I wanted to watch. For nearly 3 hours they worked. Power disconnected. Housing removed. Pipes capped and rerouted. Mounting brackets extracted. One by one the bolts that had been driven into the wall disappeared. The constant vibration that had become part of daily life simply stopped. No grand announcement. No dramatic soundtrack. Just silence. Beautiful silence. Once the equipment was gone, another crew arrived to repair the damage. Holes were patched. Stucco was replaced. Paint was matched. By early afternoon, the wall looked almost exactly as it had before Bryce ever arrived. The inspector returned later that day for a final review. He checked the repairs, examined the relocation work, completed his documentation, and prepared to leave. That's when Bryce made one final mistake. Standing on his deck with a phone in his hand and frustration written all over his face, he started muttering about lawyers, lawsuits, and unfair treatment. The inspector turned around, looked directly at him, and said, "You're currently in full violation. I'd recommend saying less, not more." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it landed harder than any courtroom speech could have. Bryce immediately went quiet. Completely quiet. The inspector signed the compliance form, got back into his vehicle, and drove away. And just like that, the conflict was over. No trial. No screaming match. No dramatic revenge. Just evidence, procedure, and consequences doing exactly what they were designed to do. The wall stood smooth again. The humming was gone. The vibration was gone. And for the first time in months, my backyard felt like my backyard again. A few weeks after everything was over, I found myself sitting in the backyard one evening watching the sun disappear behind the fence line, and the thing that struck me most wasn't the victory. It was the silence. Funny enough, the silence was what this whole story had been about from the beginning. Before Bryce moved in, I never thought about that wall. I never thought about property surveys, compliance inspections, vibration reports, or municipal code sections. Most people don't. We go through life assuming other people understand basic boundaries because we understand them ourselves. Then every once in a while, somebody comes along who sees boundaries differently. To them, rules are obstacles. Permissions are inconveniences. Other people's rights are negotiable if ignoring them makes life easier. What fascinated me afterward wasn't the equipment itself. It was Bryce's mindset. Looking back, I don't think he ever believed he was going to lose. I genuinely think he convinced himself that being confident was the same thing as being correct. That's a surprisingly common mistake. People assume the loudest person in the room knows the most. They assume the person speaking with certainty must have facts on their side. But reality doesn't work that way. Concrete doesn't care about confidence. Property records don't care about confidence. Inspectors definitely don't care about confidence. Facts tend to win arguments eventually, even if they arrive later than emotions. This is a psychological trap that catches a lot of people. When someone gets away with crossing a small boundary, they often become comfortable crossing a larger one. Then a larger one after that. Over time, they stop seeing limits altogether. In their mind, every exception becomes proof that the rules don't really apply to them. The problem is that reality keeps receipts. Every shortcut leaves evidence. Every ignored requirement creates exposure. Every decision eventually reaches a point where somebody asks a simple question. Did you have the right to do that? And once that question enters the conversation, confidence alone isn't enough. According to standard procedure, disputes involving property are rarely won by the person with the strongest emotions. They're usually won by the person with the strongest documentation. That's why I never spent my energy trying to outshout Bryce. I didn't need to. The photographs spoke for themselves. The measurements spoke for themselves. The engineer's report spoke for itself. A lot of people ask why I didn't immediately threaten legal action or start a neighborhood war. The answer is simple. Anger feels productive, but evidence is productive. They're not the same thing. Anybody can have a heated argument. Not everybody can build a case that survives scrutiny. From a legal perspective, the moment somebody starts creating a paper trail against themselves, patience becomes incredibly valuable. Every email, every report, every inspection adds another brick to a wall that eventually becomes difficult to climb over. That's exactly what happened here. The interesting thing is that I don't hate Bryce. I know that probably sounds strange after everything you've heard. But honestly, I don't. Annoyed? Absolutely. Frustrated? Without question. But hatred requires more energy than I'm willing to give away. In the end, he became his own biggest problem. Nobody forced him to install equipment where it didn't belong. Nobody forced him to ignore boundaries. Nobody forced him to double down when concerns were raised. Those were his decisions. The consequences simply followed behind them. The lesson here is bigger than noisy pool equipment or difficult neighbors. It's about respecting lines that don't belong to us. Property lines, personal boundaries, professional boundaries, all of them operate on the same principle. Life gets complicated when people start believing their convenience matters more than someone else's rights. And honestly, that's probably why this story resonated with so many people in my neighborhood afterward. Everyone has met a Bryce. Maybe not a guy with a pool pump and a renovation obsession, but someone who believes the rules are optional when they're the one benefiting. Maybe you've worked with that person. Maybe you've lived next to that person. Maybe you've even had one in your family. If you've ever dealt with someone like that, I'd be curious to hear your story because situations like this happen more often than people realize. So let me ask you this. If you came home and discovered a neighbor had attached something to your property without permission, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have confronted them immediately and tried to force the issue face to face? Drop your answer in the comments because I know people are going to have strong opinions about that one. As for me, every time I step into that backyard now, I see the same wall, the same patio, and the same quiet space my father helped build years ago. The difference is that the wall means something slightly different now. It reminds me that boundaries matter, not because they're hostile, but because they protect respect. And when somebody decides those boundaries don't apply to them, Sometimes the most powerful response isn't revenge, anger, or intimidation. Sometimes it's a folder full of evidence, a little patience, and the confidence to let the rules do their job.